Good morning, good day, or good evening, wherever you are. Rakdos is all about chaos, and that opens up possibilities for some great commander designs. I looked at every single Rakdos commander to find the most interesting ones. You can expect graveyard shenanigans, more haste than anyone could ever use, and that pinch of randomness that makes this color combination so exciting. So, whether you're petting your cat, procrastinating from work, or enjoying a nice stroll in the park, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Akul the Unrepentant is a 4 mana 5/5 Scorpion Dragon Rogue. He has flying and trample, and when you sacrifice 3 creatures, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery and only once each turn. Red is pretty good at making tokens. A card like Hordeling Outburst can provide you with enough creatures to activate Akul on its own. There's also cards like Pawn of Ulamog that reward you for sacrificing non-token creatures with spawn tokens. And one nice thing about this ability is, of course, you can just cheat any big creature onto the battlefield, but a special focus has to be put on cards that have high additional casting costs, because you can skip on casting costs. So a card like Dusk Mangler should probably be in your Akul the Unrepentant deck. Alesha Who Loves at Fate is a 3 mana 2/2 human warrior. It has first strike, and whenever Alesha attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Additionally, it has Raid, which is at the beginning of your end step. If you attack this turn, return target creature card with mana value less than or equal to Alesha's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. If we take this apart, the Raid ability makes it so Alesha does not need to attack herself. It can be just any creature you control. Of course, if you find the opportunity to attack with Alesha, you get to put +1/+1 counters on it and subsequently cast bigger things. But of course, there's other ways to buff a commander's power. To ensure you can attack every turn, you can play 1-drops like Changeling Outcast, which is a 1 mana 1/1 unblockable changeling, or Norin Swift Survivalist, which is a 1 mana 2/1, which can't block, but whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may exile it, and you may play that card from exile this turn, which means you can just safely attack with a 1-drop and then cast it later on. Another shout out goes to Buried Alive, one of the best ways to get creature cards into your graveyard. For just 3 mana, you get to put 3 creature cards in your graveyard, and it's also pretty cheap to pick up. I also wanted to mention Mardu Outrider because it's one of the few cards that cost 3 mana, have an additional casting cost that is pretty harsh to pay, but of course with Alesha you can just return it to the battlefield again, even though, let's be honest, a 3 mana 5/5 might not be good enough for your commander group. Anya Falconwrath is a 3 mana 1/3 vampire with haste. It has an activated ability where you tap Anya, discard a card, and then draw a card. Additionally, whenever you discard a card, you get to untap Anya if that card had Madness. What you want to do with this is, of course, pair it with a bunch of Madness cards. Anya's Ravager comes to mind. You could also play Archfiend of Spite. One of the cooler payoffs, it allows you to kind of flash in Archfiend of Spite, which reads whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to Archfiend, that source's controller loses that much life unless they sacrifice that many permanents. So you can just flash it in, block, and force someone to either lose life or sacrifice permanents. In my opinion, since there aren't that many great Madness payoffs, it's important to also include other discard payoffs. One could be Archfiend of Ifnir, which makes it so whenever you cycle or discard another card, you get to put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. Or cards like Containment Construct, which is a 2 mana 2/1. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you may play that card this turn. While the name might be a meme, the commander itself is certainly not. Asmo, and I'm not gonna pronounce the rest, is a human wizard, and Asmo does not have an actual casting cost. Instead, as long as you've discarded a card this turn, you may pay black or red, depending on what you have available, to cast this spell. Also, when Asmo enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for a card named the Underworld Cookbook, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Then you shuffle your library. The Underworld Cookbook is a 1 mana artifact that taps to discard a card and create a food token. Also, for 4 mana and tapping the Cookbook, you get to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it's pretty innocuous, it just discards cards, creates food tokens, so kind of actually in the same vein as Anya. But you have to remember that first of all, you have a super cheap commander, it costs 1. 2, you get artifacts out of the deal, which opens up other options as well. And 3, it gives you a reliable artifact that discards, which is not something Anya can provide. Creatures are more susceptible to removal, of course, so just having this Underworld Cookbook also is very nice. Of course, you could pair Asmo with a bunch of Madness cards, probably makes sense to include the best ones, but I want to focus more on the artifact package. You could use the food tokens to sacrifice them, play cards like Marionette Apprentice, which drains opponents for each artifact you sacrifice, and Atog, a 2-mana 1/2 that just sacrifices an artifact to get bigger, or cards like Goblin Welder, which uses artifacts to sacrifice them and return bigger artifacts from the graveyard to the battlefield. There's also a commander that works really well with Asmo and having lots of artifacts that I'm gonna mention later. One more card that I think works really well with having lots of food tokens is Inspiring Statuary, a 3-mana artifact that gives all your non-artifact spells improvise, which means your artifacts can help cast those spells by tapping them to pay for generic mana. Ayara, Widow of the Realm is a 2-faced card. On the front side, it's a 3-mana 3/3 elf noble. It taps and sacrifices another creature or artifact to deal X damage to target opponent or battle, and you gain X life, where X is the sacrificed permanent's mana value. This frontside works really well with cards that reduce their cost. The most obvious ones that came to my mind were Delve cards, where you can use your graveyard to make cards cheaper. Gurmag Angler is a card that you can play for 1 mana, but its actual mana value is of course 7, meaning Ayara will deal 7 and you will gain 7 life. On the backside, Ayara Furnace Queen is a Phyrexian Elf Noble for 4. At the beginning of combat on your turn, return up to 1 target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and you exile it at the beginning of the next end step. I think everybody knows the good big bad payoffs, a card that I haven't mentioned in a while, and it's actually probably my favorite artifact and most underrated artifact as of right now, is Sundial of the Infinite, a 2-mana artifact that lets you end the turn, only during your turn obviously, but what happens is you reanimate your Archon of Cruelty, and instead of exiling it at the beginning of the next end step, you just use Sundial of the Infinite to end the turn, and you get to keep your Archon of Cruelty. So whenever you read anything regarding exile at end of turn or sacrifice end of turn, give back end of turn, always think Sundial of the Infinite. I genuinely believe it should be included in a lot more decks than it actually is right now. The next one is probably well known. It's Blim Comedic Genius, a 4-mana 4/3 imp that heavily enforces the donate theme. It has flying, and whenever Blim deals combat damage to a player, that player gains control of target permanent you control. Then, each player, that includes you, loses life and discards cards equal to the number of permanents they control but don't own. Now, if you're the only donate player in your playgroup, generally speaking, you won't have any permanents that you control but don't own, but of course your opponents will have to discard 1, 2, 3, X amount of cards and lose X life. It is fun trying to find the worst things to give away to your friends, but remember that it might not be fun to receive the gifts that you're giving with Blim. So make sure your playgroup knows what's going on and that they could just lose the game out of nowhere because you give them the most heinous artifact ever known to Magic players. Instead, what I wanted to focus on with this, because we've talked about donate in other videos and what the payouts are, and I'm sure you'll find them, is, well, first of all, I recommend having a good chunk of cards that ensure that Blim can attack, maybe even multiple times, giving him double strike. Although that's not necessary, it's very important you protect Blim. What you definitely do not want to happen is you playing a terrible card that would lose you the game. You go to attacks and someone kills Blim before it can deal damage, and you're stuck with the terrible gift that you wanted to give away. That's like the worst possible scenario for your deck, and it's not unlikely to happen. The other thing I wanted to highlight is, while of course Blim is great at giving gifts, There are cards that just give themselves away. Cards like Sleeper Agent, 1 mana 3/3, just comes into play under an opponent's control. Or Goblin Cadets that, whenever blocks or becomes blocked, goes to some opponent. Or a Crone Horse where you can just choose an opponent that gains control of it. These cards make it so you don't have to attack with Blim. Opponents will just randomly have permanents that you own but they control, and that makes it a lot easier to ramp up the number of cards they have to discard quickly. There's also a commander that works well with Blim that I'm gonna mention at the very end of the video. We talked about Chainer in the Mono Black video, but Chainer Nightmare Adept also has a black-red version. It costs 4 mana, is a 3/2 and a human minion. It allows you to discard a card to cast a creature spell from your graveyard this turn, but you can only do so once each turn. Now this effect alone is not very impressive, but whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if you didn't cast it from your hand, it gains haste until your next turn. Obviously, if you just read the card, it means you have a creature card in hand, you discard it, you cast another creature card in your graveyard. The next turn, you just discard a card, cast a creature that you discarded last turn. Thankfully, these cards were cast from the graveyard, so they gain haste once they enter the battlefield under your control. What I want to remind you of though is that the second phrase does not specify that the creature needs to come from your graveyard. There's multiple ways to cast creatures not from your hand, for example Foretell or Plot. You could also hit someone with a Ragavan, cast a creature that you just exiled, it gains haste. Aether Vial is another example of cards entering the battlefield but not being cast from hand. And of course, if you want to build a Minotaur deck, Deathbellow Warcry is a way to get creatures from your library onto the battlefield, and Chainer will not care and give them haste anyways. So, different angles to approach this commander, even though at first he might seem very streamlined and linear. The next commander actually has a similar concept. It's Exava Rakdos Bloodwitch, a 4 mana 3/3 human cleric. Exava has First Strike and Haste, and it has Unleash. Unleash means you may have this creature enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. It can't block as long as it has a +1/+1 counter on it. Also, it gives each other creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it haste. As shown by the card herself, Unleash is definitely a mechanic that you should type into Scryfall, see what cards come up and which ones are good. But there are other keywords that work really well with this line of text. Modular comes to mind, which is a mechanic that gives 0/0 artifact creatures a +1/+1 counter, or multiple +1/+1 counters, depending on the value of modular. There's also Riot, which is typically a Gruul keyword, so green-red, but Uncivil Unrest is a 5 mana enchantment that gives all your non-token creatures Riot, which means when they enter you get to choose between a +1/+1 counter or giving them haste. Now you don't need to choose haste if you have Exava out, but if you don't have Exava out and your creatures heavily rely on haste, you can just give them haste with Uncivil Unrest. But of course that's not all. If you somehow manage to fit it into a tribal deck, cards like Banner of Kinship just distribute +1/+1 counters. And there's so many ways nowadays to get +1/+1 counters on creatures that I'm sure you'll find good payoffs for this very strong line of text. Another way to get +1/+1 counters on creatures, for example, is the next commander. It's Gev Scaled Scorch, a 2 mana 3/2 lizard mercenary. It has Ward, pay 2 life, and other creatures you control enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each opponent who lost life this turn. So a maximum of 3 in your normal commander game. Additionally, whenever you cast a lizard spell, Gev Scaled Scourge deals 1 damage to target opponent. So in a tribal deck, you would play the lizard spell before the lizard would enter, the cast trigger would go off, you would deal 1 to target opponent, and the lizard would get a +1/+1 counter. The second lizard, of course, would ping a different player, get 2 +1/+1 counters, and so on and so forth. If I were to build a Gev deck, I would completely ignore the second paragraph about lizards, because really the fact that you can give your creatures an additional +1/+1 counter for each opponent who lost life this turn, making it very possible to on turn 3 cast 1/2 creatures with 3 +1/+1 counters, is pretty crazy to me. You could cast a Bolt Wave and just for 1 mana make it so every creature gets those counters, Even better, you can play cards like Spear Spewer that every turn you just tap and you have the maximum amount of counters available for that turn. Very notably, Gev for once does not care about whether your creatures are tokens or not. So if you fit it into some sort of token producing deck, you tap your Spear Spewer, create 3 tokens, and instead of 1/1 goblins, those are 4/4 goblins, which is a huge difference. So Gev, especially because it only costs 2 mana, is very incredible to me. If you like to play with fire, Greven Predator Captain might be a commander for you. This Voltron 5 mana 5/5 human warrior has menace, and it gets +X+0, where X is the amount of life you have lost this turn. Also, whenever Greven attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, you draw cards equal to that creature's power, and you lose life equal to that creature's toughness. So, depending on what creatures you put into your deck, you can make it so you don't lose too much life by keeping the toughness low, but still draw a lot of cards. But of course, if you want, you can put very high toughness creatures in your deck and make it so Greven gets very large very quickly and kills someone in one shot. Of course, you don't even need to sacrifice a creature to pay a bunch of life. Especially black has a lot of good cards that let you freely pay life. Crick, Son of Yawgmoth comes to mind, which makes it so you can pay 2 life instead of paying black mana. Another great card in red is Treasonous Ogre, a 4 mana 2/3 that lets you pay 3 life to add a red mana to your mana pool, which can be incredible in Commander where you have 40 life to start with. One card that I found that amazed me because I didn't even know this mechanic existed is Garza's Assassin, which is a 3 mana 2/2 human assassin. You get to just sacrifice it to destroy target non-life creature, but the important part is recover. Recover means when a creature card is put into your graveyard, you may pay the recover cost and then return this card to your hand. Garza's Assassin has a recover cost of paying half your life rounded up. So if you manage to recover Garza's Assassin, you still have 40 life, you'll pay 20 life, Greven will be a 25/5 and one-shot someone, just by having Garza's Assassin in the graveyard and triggering its recover cost. If we go back to his second ability of sacrificing another creature, if you want to maximize the number of cards you're drawing and also the amount of life you're losing, good creatures could include Phyrexian Soulgorger, which is a 3 mana 8/8 that you want to get rid of immediately, or Rotting Regisaur, which is a 3 mana 7/6, which you also kind of want to get rid of immediately. If you want to build Greven in a more aggressive Voltron-y way, please make sure to include ways to gain life off of it, like Basilisk Scholar, and a personal shout out to Kediss. Kediss is a card that I think should be included in almost every, if not every, Voltron deck that can splash red. Kediss makes it so whenever your commander deals combat damage to an opponent, it also deals that much damage to each other opponent, which is just the best effect a Voltron commander can have. When talking about Asmo, I mentioned another commander that works really nicely with the food tokens that Asmo creates, and it's Imskir Iron Eater. Now, what does this Iron Eater eat? It eats artifacts. It's an 8 mana 5/5 demon, but it has affinity for artifacts, so having artifacts reduces the cost. Also, when Imskir Iron Eater enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is half the number of artifacts you control, rounded down. So you have 4 artifacts, you get to play your commander for 4 mana, and then you get to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Additionally, stapled onto the card, you have for 4 mana and sacrificing an artifact, Imskir deals damage equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value to any target. That's, of course, the ability that kind of entices me the most. Drawing cards is very nice, don't get me wrong, but I think it's very straightforward what you want to do with it. The cards that I wanted to mention for this commander are the Mirror Enforcer and Sojourner's Companion, 7 mana artifacts that also have affinity for artifacts, so you could play them for 0 mana potentially and deal 7 damage. And of course, whenever we are talking about looping high mana value artifacts, Metalwork Colossus has to be mentioned, an 11 mana 10/10 that costs X less, where X is the total amount of mana value of non-creature artifacts you control. And you get to sacrifice 2 artifacts to return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand. A non-blue spell-slinging commander. Who would have guessed we'd have this on our list? It's Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. Judith costs 5 mana, is a human shaman, 3/4, and reads, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink, or you get to create a 2/2 red imp creature token with whenever this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Obviously, for a 5 mana commander that you will heavily rely on, you need ways to protect her. I trust you'll find the best ones easily. Now, when we're talking about spell slinging outside of blue, we have to talk about what we are missing out on. It's mainly 2 things in my opinion. Good cantrips, but black and red kind of have that one covered. Obviously the quality suffers a lot because blue is the cantrip color, but at least you have a lot of red spells, instants, and sorceries that cost 1 and redraw a card. Secondly, what blue has, what other colors are mostly lacking, is cost reduces. Blue has 10s, 20 cards that reduce the cost of instants or sorceries. For a black-red deck, you would have to rely mostly on artifacts. 2 cards that you could play in your Judith deck are Cloud Key, where you just choose instant or sorcery and reduce the cost of that type, or you pay 1 more mana to play Primal Amulet, which reduces the cost of both, and you could potentially flip it depending on whether you think that's necessary or not. Now the dream scenario, of course, is we're thinking we're playing Judith, and either the next turn or the same turn we just play Blazing Volley for 1 mana, which deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. We give that spell Death Touch and Lifelink, and we destroy every creature that our opponents control and gain that much life. This is insane, and it will really make your opponents wary of committing too many cards into your Judith the next time. The first option definitely is super duper flashy. Just thinking of how much life you could get off of 1 Blasphemous Act hitting a board of 20 creatures is crazy, but I think the second line of text is what will win you the game, just casually while doing impressive stuff, choosing the first option. Karazakar the Eye Tyrant is a 5 mana 5/5 Beholder. Whenever you attack a player, you get to tap target creature that player controls and goad it. Also, whenever an opponent attacks another one of your opponents, you and the attacking player each draw a card and lose 1 life. If you want to make good use of the first ability, I can only recommend kind of the same creatures that Alesha also wants to play, like Changeling Outcast, Norin Swift Survivalist, so you can attack, make sure your creatures don't die when attacking, so you can goad other creatures. Of course, Karazakar is best supported by all the great goad support that black and red have. But what I like about Karazakar is that you don't necessarily need to goad creatures, because let's be honest, the second line of text is kind of tempting anyways. I could hit the controller of Karazakar, or I could hit someone else and draw a card and lose 1 life. Sure, they also get to draw a card, but most importantly, I get to draw a card. So while you will probably play this in a goad deck, even creatures that aren't goaded might want to attack another player besides you, so you can draw a card. If you do want to force your opponents to attack, Kardur Doomscourge is one of the best commanders out there. It's a 4 mana 4/3 Demon Berserker, and when Kardur Doomscourge enters the battlefield, until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able and attack a player other than you if able. Also, whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. While Kardur doesn't necessarily say goading, it kind of is goading, but it's better in a very important way. If you were to goad all creatures on the battlefield, if my opponent would then cast a creature that has haste, that creature would not be goaded. But Kardur very distinctively cares only about the opponents, so even if someone end of turn before they untap creates a creature token, or if they play a creature with haste, that creature would still not be able to attack you unless you're the only target available. Also, this is important if you have a card like Frenzied Saddlebrute, which makes it so all creatures can attack your opponents and planeswalker they control as though they had haste. In addition to that, the second line of text, whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, makes it so your own attacking creatures, should you have a bunch of tokens, will drain opponents, and that's a neat way to also close out the game. For the next one, I'm a bit clueless, but I love the flavor, I love the artwork, and I'm also kind of curious what you guys have to say about this one. It's Kethek Crucible Goliath, a 4-mana 4/4 Phyrexian beast. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value. Put it onto the battlefield, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in random order. So my idea of this would be some mixture of good value cards, aristocrats effects that pay you off for sacrificing stuff, and maybe stealing opponents' creatures. Right, I steal your commander, I sacrifice it to Kethek, and then I gain a creature out of it anyways. But truly, breaking it seems a little hard to me because you have to sacrifice a creature, and the creature you roll into has to cost less, which means you can't do the polymorph trick, which would be playing creature tokens, sacrificing the token, and then revealing just any creature, no matter the mana cost, from your library. So I really like this machine that siphons the life out of its environment, and I really like that it has this polymorph / birthing pod-esque effect, but I can't really tell you how to build it because I myself find it interesting but don't really know what I would do with it. For the next card though, I definitely know what I would do, and it is so degenerate, it's hilarious. It's Mishra, Tamer of Makbawa, a 5-mana 4/4 human artificer. First of all, permanents you control have ward, sacrifice a permanent. That will definitely teach your opponents not to target too many of your permanents. But the second line of text is straight up busted. Each artifact card in your graveyard has Unearth 3, which means you get to return that card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, but you have to exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would leave the battlefield in any other way. Now, you've heard me say this video. Whenever you read the line, exile at the beginning of next end step, you have to think Sundial of Infinite. But even if you don't have Sundial of the Infinite, I don't need to tell you that reanimating something even just for 1 turn for 3 mana from your graveyard and giving it haste is crazy. I would probably put this in a shell that plays mostly big creatures that I can reanimate from the graveyard. And if it is an artifact, it needs to have a huge ETB or provide insane instant value otherwise. You could make it a combo deck with Bolas' Citadel, and I would pair Mishra with a set of cards like Goblin Welder or Trash for Treasure that make it so you sacrifice an artifact on the field to get a big artifact back from the graveyard permanently. And then of course, there's tons of good artifact creatures that you just throw in the bin and reanimate for 3 mana. Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin is a 4-mana 4/3 demon. It has flying and trample, and whenever 1 or more opponents each lose exactly 1 life, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Ob Nixilis and exile the top card of your library. Until your next end step, you may play that card. This is a take on the ping type deck, but usually ping decks have a secondary goal to make your pings deal more than 1 damage, right? You buff it with Torbrand, for example, making them deal 2 more damage. This doesn't work with Ob Nixilis. What I'm thinking is, besides pingers, cards like Goblin Bombardment, which make it so you can sacrifice tokens to turn them into card advantage, which can be incredibly powerful. Of course, if we're thinking pingers, cards like Spear always come to mind, or Thermo Alchemist, which untaps whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. This could mean that you could potentially combo off in a Storm way, where you just tap Alchemist, deal 1 to everyone, exile the top card. If it's an instant or a sorcery, great, you get to play that card, untap your Thermo Alchemist, tap again, and so on and so forth. Besides that, of course, you could also attack each opponent with a 1/1 that's somehow unblockable and still trigger this. But I think cards like Goblin Bombardment are probably the best way to approach this deck building challenge. So good luck. Olivia, Mobilized for War, is a 3 mana 3/3 Vampire Knight. It has flying, of course, it's a vampire, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may discard a card. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, it gains haste until end of turn and also becomes a vampire. This is a very interesting take on vampires. Usually you would just, play Edgar Markov, all your vampires create an extra vampire and you put only vampires in your deck. And it's, in my opinion, a very simple way to build a deck. Although, of course, I'm not saying that's wrong or bad, but Olivia makes it so you don't have to play vampire payoffs. Of course, it is encouraged, but just imagine playing Olivia on turn 3. Turn 4, you play Zombify, one of the most basic reanimate effects out there, and you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature and give it haste. I think with Chainer, we've shown that haste can be very, very powerful on some creatures. Most creatures are balanced around not having haste, and their attack trigger only going off one turn, later giving your opponents a chance to react. But, of course, if we can give any creature haste, that's great. Additionally, vampires do have the Madness sub-theme, and Olivia also fits right in there. It allows you to discard cards whenever a creature comes into play. It gives +1/+1 counters, so you could maybe build a deck about Olivia and Anya and really go all into Madness on one hand, but creatures gaining haste on the other hand also. Maybe you even include Chainer. Mishra was already kind of degenerate, very degenerate if we're being honest. But Rakdos, Lord of Riots, is not much better. It's a 4 mana 6/6 demon, and you can't cast this spell unless an opponent lost life this turn. I mean, you're playing black and red, kind of nothing is easier than that. It has flying and trample, but most importantly, creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. Now, notably, this does not reduce commander text because Rakdos is not on the battlefield, so its effect can't reduce itself. But I don't think I have to say much more than play Rakdos next turn, Bolt Wave, and cast Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger for 1 mana. Does that sound good to you? It sounds pretty good to me. But we have more Rakdoses to talk about. Rakdos the Muscle is a 5 mana 6/5 demon mercenary that has flying and trample. Whenever you sacrifice another creature, exile cards equal to its mana value from the top of target player's library. Until your next end step, you may play those cards and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. Also, you get to sacrifice another creature to give Rakdos the Muscle indestructible, although you do have to tap it, and you only get to activate it once each turn. In general, I think these not super commander-centric decks that are mostly value engines from the command zone can be extremely fun. Rakdos makes it so you could potentially steal other people's stuff and then sacrifice the creature to give Rakdos indestructible. Your opponent is down a creature and you get to even play one of their cards. A quick shout out goes to Laughing Jasper Flint, who almost made the list. It's a 3 mana 4/3 lizard rogue that makes it so creatures you control but don't own are mercenaries in addition to their other types. And at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top X cards of your target opponent's library, where X is the number of outlaws you control. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among the cards that you exiled, and of course use mana of any type to cast those spells. Those two work really well in tandem, which makes sense because they are from the same set. But yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to a card that isn't fully commander centric, but instead encourages a more value based approach that is more about the 99. All good things come in 3, and last but not least from the Rakdoses, we have Rakdos the Showstopper, a 6 mana 6/6 flying trample demon. When Rakdos the Showstopper enters the battlefield, flip a coin for each creature that isn't a demon, devil, or imp. Destroy each creature whose coin comes up tails. I won't go into too much detail about how I would approach building this deck. In my opinion, it's relatively straightforward. Just play a bunch of demons, devils, and imps, and you have a semi-board wipe from the command zone. I wanted to give a shout out to this Rakdos because to me, it's the embodiment of what Rakdos does. Who would have guessed? I don't think that's very surprising. It is Rakdos after all. The entire color combination is named after this guy. Flipping a coin causing chaos, but always being the benefactor of the chaos that ensues around the table is very typical for this color combination to me. I also love this simple flavor text of entertain me. It makes everyone scared of your commander even when they're not close to being played because they need to think ahead. Do I want to play this creature? It's possible it just dies to Rakdos. Rankle and Torbran is one of those team up commanders we got in March of the Machines. It costs 5 mana, is a fairy dwarf, has pretty good keywords because it has flying, first strike, and haste. That's a very good assortment of keywords. And whenever Rankle deals combat damage to a player or battle, choose any number. Each player creates a treasure token, each player sacrifices a creature, or if a source would deal damage to a player or battle this turn, it deals that much damage +2 instead. If we dissect the ability, the first option is pretty hard to break. It gives every player a treasure token. You are the only one who's allowed to cast creatures and sorceries the turn you get it, but ultimately you might be ramping everyone. Of course, there's a way to punish this, but that's pretty fringe and probably not the part that I would focus on. The second option though is much more interesting. Each player sacrifices a creature. This reminds me of, all those stacks commanders, reminiscent maybe of Braids, Arisen Nightmare, or the band Braids even. It's all about resource denial and getting more out of your creatures, so death triggers or tokens. And especially tokens is something that I want to focus on because the third ability works really well with tokens as well. Now, if you're maybe newer to the game, it's a little unintuitive, and you might think, well, Rankle deals damage, but all of my creatures will have dealt damage at the same time, right? Because that's how combat works. But because Rankle has first strike, it deals damage before all other creatures that do not have first strike. In that sense, it reminds me of Drana, Liberator of Malakir, which put +1/+1 counter on attacking creatures when it dealt damage. So really what happens, you attack with Rankle and a 1/1 Goblin token. Rankle will deal 3 damage. You choose the third option, and your Goblin token would also deal 3 damage. Now, maybe this doesn't sound crazy to you, but it kind of is. Damage doubling effects cost 4 to 5 mana usually, and for 1/1 tokens, this is a damage tripling effect, which is much more expensive. So Rankle and Torbran, like many of these team up commanders, can be taken into different direction, and it's definitely interesting to see what people come up with when they choose this commander. We haven't really had like a pure tribal commander so far, but Rivers of the Claw will fix that. It's a 3 mana 3/3 Viashino Warlock. It has Menace and taps to add 2 mana in any combination of colors, but you only get to spend that mana on dragon creature spells. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard. But when you cast a dragon spell from your graveyard, the dragon gains when this creature dies, you exile it, so you can't repeatedly cast the same dragon. To me, when I read this, it was kind of the modern twist on Bladewing, the Risen, which is a dragon that just gets you a dragon from your graveyard when it enters. It encourages you to put dragons into your graveyard. It enforces dragon tribal in a way, right? You want to do this multiple times, and Bladewing had this niche ability where it could give dragons +1/+1, so you also wanted to have loads of dragons. But it's of course way better. It's a 3 mana card that ramps you if you cast it to 5 mana next turn if you hit your land drop, 6 mana, which is where a lot of the juicy dragons are. But also, of course, you get to recur cards from graveyard, so even after a board wipe, this helps you rebuild. You could mill yourself and find good dragons and cast them from your graveyard. And I mean, there is obvious picks for dragon commanders, and yes, you are losing out by picking just black-red as your colors for dragon. But let's not kid ourselves, red is the premier dragon color, and the good cost reducers like Dragon Lord's Servant and Dragon Speaker Shaman are available to you. There's also Dragon Tempest, which in my opinion is the best payoff for playing dragons. And even Crux of Fate, a one-sided board wipe should you have only dragons, except for your commander, but I mean, still good enough, are all available to you, so don't fret. It also has the advantage of being a lot cheaper on the mana base if you don't want to play Ur-Dragon, so I can only recommend giving Rivers of the Claw a try if you want to build a different type of dragon commander deck. We talked about Will, Sign of Peace in the blue-white video, so let's talk about Rowan, Sign of War in this video. Rowan costs 3 mana for a 4/2 human wizard. It has Menace, and most importantly, it taps to reduce the cost of black and or red spells you cast this turn by X, where X is the amount of life you've lost this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. Funnily enough, this works with a lot of cards that Greven, who we've previously talked about, also works with. Crick is awesome. It lets you cast spells cheaper by paying life, and additionally, it will also reduce spells by more if you tap Rowan afterwards. Treasonous Ogre pays a bunch of life to create more mana and kind of has the same dynamic. Ultimately, the same principles as for Will apply to Rowan, so I'm not gonna explain everything. Instead, I'm gonna shamelessly recommend you watch the blue-white video as well. Ultimately, your goal would be to lose a bunch of life, play cards like Crick and Treasonous Ogre, and finish your opponents off with X spells like Exsanguinate, where each opponent loses X life and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. Phoenix Tribal is slowly becoming a real thing, and thankfully it's mostly in red. That way Syrinx, Carrier of the Flame, can be considered a valid option for your commander. It's a 4 mana 3/3, it's a Phoenix, it has flying and haste because it's a Phoenix. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature card left your graveyard this turn, target Phoenix you control deals damage equal to its power to any target. Also, whenever another Phoenix you control dies, you may cast Syrinx, Carrier of the Flame from your graveyard. Unfortunately, the conditions for bringing back Phoenixes can differ greatly. You probably shouldn't play Arclight Phoenix and Phoenix Chick in the same deck, but thankfully, Syrinx doesn't even need you to play that many Phoenixes. Of course, Phoenixes are creatures that will leave the graveyard regularly and thus trigger the second paragraph quite frequently. But note that Syrinx doesn't care about where the creature goes to. It could go to the battlefield, but it could also go back to hand. If you're willing to sacrifice some of your graveyard, it could even go to the exile zone. In this regard, it kind of reminds me of Sir Conrad, which doesn't really discriminate where the creature goes. Of course, I don't recommend skipping out on Phoenixes completely, especially since those can make it so you can just safely let Syrinx go to the graveyard, because you know you can just for 4 mana return him later on, and thus skipping out on commander decks. The infamous Cruel Claw is a 3 mana 3/3 Weasel Mercenary. It has Menace because it is very scary, this Weasel. Whenever the infamous Cruel Claw deals combat damage to a player, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card by discarding a card rather than paying its mana cost. So let's get back to some good old mana cheating. This card is a little Voltron, it's a little Madness because you get to discard cards, it's a little Reanimation because you want to play big spells anyways that you hit off the ability, but sometimes you also want to discard the big creatures that are stuck in your hand. It might be worth to look at cards like Brainstone that let you manipulate the top of your library, or more likely cards like Doom Whisperer, where you get to repeatedly pay to life to surveil 2 and thus kind of have the same effect of knowing what you're gonna draw into with the ability of infamous Cruel Claw. Maybe there's also some combo-y deck out there that plays mostly lands, so you have 2 to 3 different hits, kind of like treasure hunt decks used to work. But I'll leave that up to your creativity and your playgroup whether that is viable and or fun. Duskmourn brought some interesting designs to the table for Magic, and one of them is certainly Lord of Pain, a 5 mana 5/5 human assassin. It has Menace, and your opponents can't gain life. A line of text that I've definitely learned to value a lot playing Erebos, God of the Dead. Whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, you get to choose another target player. Lord of the Dead deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to the chosen player. There isn't too much in our control with this card. After all, 3 out of 4 cases of this triggering will be other people casting spells. But of course, the first spell you cast each turn also counts towards this ability. This means you could play delve cards or any other big spells that can be reduced in their casting cost. Gurmag Angler comes to mind, playing it for 1 mana, dealing 7 damage to somewhere. Very good, but This card will just sneakily and sometimes not so sneakily kill your opponents. They can't gain life to counteract the life they're losing each turn. And yeah, you get to choose who gets to suffer. Isn't that nice? In the blue-black video, we talked about one of my favorite commanders we've looked at so far, the Skeleton Ship. A kind of completely unplayable commander if we're being honest, but we talked about this -1/-1 counter shell you could build around it. Thankfully, pretty much every good payoff for -1/-1 counters we talked about is mono black. This means if we take a look at the Scorpion God, a much more viable card, we can basically refer to the same cards. Let's talk about the Scorpion God. For 5 mana, you get a 6/5 God. Whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you get to draw a card. For 3 mana, you get to put a -1/-1 counter on another target creature. And because it's a god, there is some way it can cheat death. In this case, when it dies, you return it to your owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So you kind of always get to cheat commander attacks. There will be hardly any reason to not let it go to your hand. As I've said, most of the -1/-1 counter payoffs are mono black. So let's look at them again. There's Crumbling Ashes, which makes it so at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to destroy target creature with a -1/-1 counter on it. There's Maha, its Feather's Knight, which makes it so all your opponent's creatures have base toughness 1. There's Massacre Girl, and a surprisingly expensive Necro Skitter, which makes it so whenever a creature an opponent controls with a -1/-1 counter on it is put into a graveyard, you may return that card to play under your own control. The only downside the Scorpion has compared to the Skeleton Ship is that you are missing out on a huge portion of the Proliferate package, but let's be honest, having a much more powerful commander really does make up for that. If you, for some reason, hate your friends, why not pull out Tsabo Tavok? It's a 7 mana 7/4 Phyrexian Horror. It has First Strike and protection from legendary creatures. And as if that wasn't enough, for 2 black mana and tapping Tsabo, you get to destroy target legendary creature. It can't be regenerated. I mean, this really just hates on commanders and other legendary creatures. If that is a thing you want to do, go ahead. But I also want to mention 7 times 3 is 21, so maybe this is just a Voltron commander disguised as a hate piece. Last but not least, a callback to another commander we talked about earlier in the video. Do you remember when we talked about Blim and creatures that give themselves to other players? Well, there is a commander that does just that, aptly named Xancha Sleeper Agent, a 3 mana 5/5 Phyrexian minion. Xancha enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of your choice. Xancha also attacks each combat if able and can't attack its owner or planeswalkers its owner controls, so you. What this kind of reads like in modern day is Xancha is permanently goated. Last but not least, for 3 generic mana, Xancha's controller loses 2 life and you draw a card. Any player may activate this ability. The way this feels is kind of like a curse. Curse enchantments are enchantments you play on a player and they kind of get punished for doing stuff where everyone else gets rewarded for picking on them. And Xancha kind of does the same. You give it to someone and then everybody, always, no matter which turn, has the ability to just drain them for 2 and draw a card. That's pretty mean. Xancha works very nicely in goading style decks where you make sure nobody attacks you anyways. You just sit back and relax, and in typical Rakdos fashion, you get to enjoy the chaos and the show. I will start linking a Moxfield decklist with all the mentioned commanders as well as most of the other cards I mentioned in this video in the description down below, so you don't have to scroll through the video when you are looking for a specific card. I'd be curious. In what situations are you watching these types of videos? Tell me in the comments down below, I need some inspiration for future intros. Anyways, always remember, be kind to yourself and others. Goodbye.